and how do you develop a board and those kinds of things. And so I also learned a lot from that perspective. So I worked there for about 2.5 years, and then I went from there to the Jane Addams Hull House Museum at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I was there from 2008 until 2011. And I loved it there. It was a fabulous time to be at the museum because the director at that time really reinvigorated that museum. It was nationally known, especially among social workers and, people in related fields. And it was known as a site of research and definitely had an exhibit. But it had come to be known as sort of like a historical place, but not really a place where a lot of different types of people outside of those fields would go and be excited about visiting. So the director at the time was someone who was just super imaginative and creative and really infused a lot of public programs and outward-facing activities and collaborations, and really over time with also a very gifted staff, made the Hull House Museum a destination for a lot of different types of people. A lot more students at UIC and other places and advocates started coming there and having meetings and attended, our events and public programs there. The tours picked up. Eventually, the director, along with a team of other people at the university, decided that the museum needed to be restored and install a new permanent exhibit to expand on the exhibit to not only talk about the Hull House Museum's past, but also how the issues that the Hull House Museum address in terms of labor rights, in terms of civic participation, in terms of shaping politics, in terms of race and class and immigrant rights, like that work is relevant today. And so there was a new permanent exhibit installed, as well as rotating multimedia exhibits. And it just really became this really fascinating place to be. So it was great to work there for 3 years. And then after then, I went to graduate school, but I also at the Harris School of Public Policy. It was a fabulous decision I made. But I also volunteered with Affinity Community Services, and I just have so much fondness for that organization. When I came out at Wellesley, it was a wonderful place to realize I was gay, and I had a place of support and many friendships. And when I came to Chicago, it was like going back into a closet again. My parents, in particular my mother, had a really hard time with it. I have an aunt who had a really hard time with it, and it's an aunt who wound up disowning me and hasn't wanted to talk to me since 2002. So after I graduated from Wellesley and came back to Chicago, I was really looking for a community of LGBTQ folks, and including Black LGBTQ people, and Affinity, being a social justice organization based on the South Side that primarily works with and on behalf of Black LGBTQ folks and youth, became that place. So it was very warm. It was inviting. I attended events and all kinds of stuff. I could be myself. And I wound up serving in a few volunteer capacities, including the board. So I also spent a lot of time there as a volunteer.
Thank you for sharing that. I kind of want to take a bit of a deviated path from the outline questions, if you feel comfortable answering it.
Absolutely.
But I hear so much of my story reflected in what you just mentioned, very similar experience in terms of coming out in college as opposed to an earlier age. What advice would you have to offer young queer people of color that might be going through a similar transition right now, in terms of how they can also build those communities amongst their areas?
That's interesting in terms of how they can build it. You mean if they're looking for support in some way as they're realizing that they're queer or LGBTQ? I would say, one, in some ways it's a little easier now to find those places, because when I was coming out, there wasn't social media yet. So there was online, but not social media. And I know that's not the same as having someone be in person, but at least that is a tool to look perhaps for communities and spaces that may be nearby, wherever you are, your school, your neighborhood, what have you, to see sort of what's in your neck of the woods, so to speak. And I would say if that doesn't exist, somehow tap into your courage to create it. I know that's easier said than done, but the reason why I say that is because that's how Affinity Community Services came into existence. There were mostly women, but also some men who came together and said, we need a space on the South Side of Chicago. Not all of us live on the north side. We have support needs. We also want friendship. We want fun and camaraderie. We want a safe space to where we can be ourselves. And we also have certain services and programs that our folks need on the south side. That didn't exist, but they created it. It started out in a basement of someone's home. It went from being a grassroots collective to a more established organization, but one that's still connected to community. And 22 years later, it's still in existence. But that started with a few individuals coming together to create something that didn't exist. So I would say, tap into and see what does exist, perhaps that you can become a part of and create community and be supported, to be respected. And if it doesn't exist, don't be afraid to create it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that's going to resonate with somebody out there that definitely needed to hear that.
I hope
today.
So.
So kind of going off of that, I would like to ask, what do you feel are some of the most prevalent issues you find that queer women of color are facing, both within the community and outside of the community?
Wow. Inside the community. Well, when I think of inside the LGBTQ community, some of the issues are similar to the issues that are experienced outside of LGBTQ communities and spaces. So within LGBTQ communities, there are racial tensions. And there is racial tensions and racism. There's also stigma. So not all of the letters are treated equally. Some are more marginalized and more silenced than others at times. So there's been increasing I shouldn't say trans visibility, because trans people have always been around, but in terms of more trans awareness of various issues that trans people experience. I think that that's something that has improved, but there are still issues that people have with some trans folks in our community. So LGBTQ community has that. I think bisexual people, it's amazing. I read a report recently that talked about, in terms of domestic violence, sometimes mental health outcomes, bisexual people experience, they go through a lot. Because there isn't just stigma from the broader society, but also stigma within gay communities, like pick a side already, or bisexuality, is not a legitimate orientation. And there are people who are attracted to both men and women. And I know that there are people who are gender expansive, but there are people who are also bi, who are attracted to men and women. And oftentimes some bi people just don't feel supported at all. I think that there are some health outcomes that a lot of queer women face in terms of receiving culturally competent health care. And culturally competent, not just in terms of the LGBT or Q, based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, but sometimes other issues in terms of their ethnicities, their culture, and those kinds of things, and being respected and being heard and listened to. I'm thinking in particular, and this isn't even just with queer folks, but what some women experience when they're going to the doctor, and certain questions that are asked or not asked that can have huge consequences in terms of how one is treated in the health field. Just thinking of Black women in terms of maternal health, right, and certain health outcomes related to that. And this isn't even just relegated to queer women, but Black women, period, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, and across economic lines. So even Black women who are middle and upper middle class, have really disproportionate health complications and are more likely to die during or right after childbirth. So I think that there are, speaking of intersections, when you're talking about health and wellness outcomes, and you're talking about also alcohol use, tobacco use, off the charts for LGBTQ people. And definitely, I would say queer women of color also, but even across gender lines, across sex lines, and I think that some of that is just, yes, some of us like to drink and smoke on occasion. Some of us go too far in general, but some of it, for some of us, I do think has to do with perhaps self-medicating because of some of the things that we experience. So those are some of the things that come to mind, right away when I think of some really pressing issues that impact our health and our well-being, and certain issues around stigma that are a bit more sobering.
Yeah. In follow-up to that, I guess I would like to ask, like, what do you think the role of policy is in addressing some of those issues? And that can be, like, as general as, like, policy with a lowercase p, or as specific as a, individual policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, public policies can allocate resources and enforce decisions that are made, right? And so I think that public policy can play a role in bringing to bear legislative action that can make an impact in terms of how resources are delivered, or guidelines in terms of how organizations or institutions should deliver on what their mission is. So I think that those are some of the ways that public policy can play a role, as well as research in terms of, well, who's being the most impacted by X, Y, and Z policy? What was the intention versus the effect? Good intentions don't make good policy. That's what they kept, they drill that in us at the Harris School, right? Like it's important to have good intentions. Not everyone does in public policy, but good intentions don't necessarily make good policy. And so who is at the table when these policies are being considered? What are the access and entry points? Because if a certain policy is going to disproportionately impact, let's say, Black gay men between the ages of 18 and 35 who are HIV, and there are no Black gay men at the table, or there are at least no no organizations that serve or work with and on behalf of Black gay men, there isn't that voice. There's no research being done to find out what their experiences are. What are some of their choices? What are their other health outcomes? Are there intersecting experiences? If that kind of work isn't being done on the front end as policies are being drafted, and there's no follow through after policies are passed through the legislative body, so there's no muscle behind it, then what good is it's not effective policymaking.
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there in terms of visibility not being something simply in terms of tokenism, but in terms of truly bringing awareness and new perspectives in terms of solving these issues, as well as bringing awareness to communities that just have no idea, that even if they're well-intended, have no idea the issues that are facing certain groups of people.
Right.
And that's a really, really, I think, good transition into the next question. So as someone like you who has done a good bit of work in the nonprofit sector, one of the most challenging and I think at times frustrating elements of the nonprofit sector is specifically the lack of representation in executive management of these nonprofits. So there are a lot of amazing organizations doing amazing work, and you'll see that their entry-level or case manager staff are people from the community who truly understand these issues, but you look at directors and they're not from the community, or they've not been there or lived there, and they don't look like the people that they're serving. And that leads to, I think, miscommunications and disconnect from these resources. So what do you think are things that nonprofits and community actors across the board can do to make themselves more inclusive and more representative of the people they're championing?
Well, if they're really about their mission in terms of really better serving that population and about access and equity, then they're going to make sure that those populations are represented in executive leadership. Otherwise, I would say you really don't believe in your mission. So if you can have women and, let's say, Black folks or Mexican Americans answering your phones and being interns working for free, but they can't be directors or managers, that's a problem. And by the way, nothing wrong with, I've worked as assistants and secretaries and stuff like that. That's not putting that work down. But people from those backgrounds should also be able to be represented in terms of executive leadership and key decision making as well. And so if there really is a will, then they will do the outreach and also succession plan to make sure that they are helping employees develop themselves and their talents and skills so that they, newer and younger people coming in who are hopefully more diverse, I shouldn't say, I hate putting it that way, but who are from more of a variety of populations that typically are not in certain decision-making roles, that there is real mentorship, that there's real intentionality in terms of developing leaders, in terms of making sure that there are people who at the organization who look like some of the populations being served. And that's not, and I don't even mean just in terms of what is your race or what is your gender, but also people who come from a variety of different perspectives, life experiences, backgrounds. I think we often lose sight of that too. We think diversity is just about the color of your skin, or not we, but some people